Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming here to our Scaling Risks, How to Effectively Grow Your Global Sales event. We've got a good group here, but I think we're small enough that we can probably pass the mic around and hear from everyone, just your name and where you work. I'm Jim Porter. I'm with the World Trade Center, Utah. For those of you who don't know us, we are here to accelerate growth for Utah companies. We have networks, programs, and services we plug companies into to expand their global footprint on the sales and sourcing side. Today, we're really excited to hear from Jonathan Bench and Mike Criddle. Jonathan is a partner at Harris Bricken, where he consults with clients on a number of different international business items. And Mike is a partner at Eide Bailly, where he is a leader in their global tax services. And so you couldn't ask for two better people to be talking to you today about scaling. I'm going to let them introduce themselves when we get the program formally underway. But before we do that, we're going to pass around the microphone. Love to hear again who you are and which company you represent. Thanks.
Shoot, I hate going first. Hey, Max Stitzer, good to see you, meet y'all. Just retired back here home July 1st from the Air Force after a 39-year career. I was a general stationed at the Pentagon in the last 4 years. So I'm having withdrawals, graduating and transitioning from unlimited resources to owning my own small business. Good to meet y'all.
Good afternoon, everybody. Gianpaolo Zini, CEO of CNZ Global Advisors, international business development and financial advisors, international attorney, licensed in Europe and New York. I'm not practicing law here, so no competition meant.
My name is Dave Watkins. I'm also with Eide Bailly with Mike Criddle. I'm in the Salt Lake office just down here. Yeah, looking forward to it.
I'm Matt Blackwelder with Wolf Optics. We're an eyewear brand here in North Salt Lake, and just excited to grow our global sales and learn about this. And we've been doing a lot of work with the World Trade Center, so we love these guys. So.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Danny Lysenko. Also, along with Mike, with Eide Bailly, I lead the retail consulting business for the firm.
Hi, Mike May with ANC International. We're a global freight forwarder. And then I also own a small backpack business here named Pingora.
Hi, I am Natalie Hood, and I'm also with Eide Bailly. So we're very Eide Bailly heavy here. But I work in the marketing realm, so I work pretty closely with Mike and all the other partners on our marketing initiatives.
My name's Scott Michaels. I own a small business here called Victory. And a couple of things that we do. One is we're helping companies that are in China to transition over to the Philippines, better rates, better products. They all speak English. It's kind of a fun thing. So.
My name is Franz Kolb. I am the director of the Center for International Business and Diplomacy in the Governor's Office. So I'm delighted to be here, and I have had the opportunity to work with this attorney here for a long time. And so I'm very grateful to be here and learn about scaling risks. I do not have a business called Defeated, but I like Victory.
Good afternoon. My name is David Utrilla. I am the CEO of US Translation Company. Our company headquarters are here in downtown Salt Lake, but we have operations and sales all over the world. I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to this scaling risk seminar.
Hi, I'm Malia Bauer. I'm with the investment team here at World Trade Center, Utah. So after this discussion, if any of you have any questions about sourcing investment for your company or establishing ties outside of sourcing internationally, you can come chat with me and we can explore that possibility.
Hi, I'm Charlotte, also with World Trade Center, Utah. A lot of familiar faces in here. I think I'm on our international programs team. So the business trips, manage trade missions and trade shows we do. I coordinate the back end logistics and have been on a lot of trips with you guys. So good to see friendly faces in here.
Hi, I'm Janelle Jones. I'm with True Vision Health, known as Truvi, and I'm the controller there. And we work with Mike over at Eide.
I'm Brett Brady. I'm also with True Vision Health. We're expanding our global presence quite a bit in Asia, so I thought it'd be great to come here and learn a little bit more.
My name is Greg Wright. I'm with Zab Translation. We're based in Spanish Fork, but we help companies with their translation needs, specifically written translation in 120 different languages. So if I can help you with any of your translation needs, feel free to reach out. Love World Trade Center. It's a great resource for business.
Jerome Bichon, International General Counsel Bucked Up, General Counsel Solex, and business owner of VG Power, a Utah company.
Paul Howell with Wells Fargo Bank in their commercial banking group.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I think we're going to take about 40 minutes for a presentation from Jonathan and Mike, after which we'll have an opportunity to have some Q&A. Jonathan, Mike, take it away.
You want to intro him first, Mike?
Sure. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see you. I appreciate you taking some time to join with us today. We're excited to talk about a topic we're both passionate about. I love helping companies expand internationally. I've been doing international tax since the start of my career years ago when I was with Big Four. Luckily, at this juncture in my career, I'm with Eide Bailly and have the opportunity to do a lot of it work with U.S. companies that are expanding internationally and foreign companies that are expanding in the U.S. I've come to recognize over the last several years that there are a lot of risks that companies face as they expand globally. And so I think it's always a valuable discussion to talk about what expanding globally looks like, what are the risks, both from a legal and tax perspective. So I met Jonathan some time ago, and we've been collaborating for the last little while and assisting clients with tax and legal needs relative to their expansion.
Mike and I have a good time. We probably talk, maybe not weekly, but several times a month about client projects. We started collaborating. I brought you to World Trade Center, right? I brought Eide Bailly here, and I found Mike because when I moved back from the East Coast, and I needed some international CPAs to help with my client projects, and so I started reaching out. And it may surprise you, but to specialize, it's easy to be an accountant or a lawyer in the U.S. and never have to really touch an international piece of a project. You can build a decent practice in my world. You can be a Utah oil and gas attorney, never have to worry about anything international at all. And so we have to, and I've been rubbing shoulders a lot just this past year with a lot of European lawyers. And in Europe, you have to be international because Luxembourg is only so big and Belgium is only so big, right? And so in the US, it's a little bit different. So it's an interesting crowd of people. And I think Utah, we punch above our weight here, of course, because of our international aspirations. But I think it's just a lot of good energy here and a lot of pragmatic business people. So I found that's me coming back as a professional. I came out to BYU, grew up in Wisconsin, came out to BYU, left to go to law school and do my first job on the East Coast, and then came back about 2018. So it's been interesting. I think we've got a lot of good things going on here. Professionally, I suppose, I've an international business lawyer. I lived in Hong Kong and China for a few years, many moons ago. And then that started me on my path to international things, and just been kind of growing my repertoire since then. So it's been fun. And then lately, just on being interested, on a hunch, I decided I would look into blockchain and figure out what was going on there. So it took me some time digging in, and that's been fun. So now I guess I consider myself an emerging technology lawyer because I like tech, and a lot of the technology stretches across international borders. So it makes for some fun conversations with some interesting, colorful people sometimes. So I guess we'll get started. I think I'm leading this off, right, Mike? And we're very open. I'll speak for Mike. We're open. If you have questions, anything at all, raise your hands in the middle, interrupt us. It's fine. We'll have Q&A time at the end, but there may be something pressing on your mind, or maybe something relevant you read in the news recently and you want to know, how does this impact global business? What does it mean for us? We're happy certainly to take those questions. So let's go to, and yeah, there we go. Thanks. So we have Mike. Mike asked me, because of my expertise in China, he said it might be good to just kind of take a global view on what's going on right now. Much of what we're dealing with now professionally, at least in the international space, is China driven. It's either It's either dealing with China or it's because of China that we're in a room like this having conversations where we have to decide what happens next. What feasibly is going to happen? Where are we now? How do we get in this mess that we're in now? Is it even possible to get out? So we have a lot of different, a lot of questions, a lot of hard questions, and a lot of smart people all over the world wrestling with this in many nations, and not a lot of easy answers. So I'm gonna look at my slides for a second here. So some common themes, if you're a China follower like I am, some of this will sound familiar, and maybe yes, maybe no. I follow a lot of very smart people on China, and so I don't even take credit for any of this originality, but it's important to understand all of these things. So China, it's a socialist country, right? They have socialist roots from Marxist Leninist society. The Chinese basically think they can do it better than the Russians did. They said USSR messed things up. In China, we can still hold on to the power. We know what's best, and we will continue to do that. So that's the theme. That's why we have terms like common prosperity that are creeping up in discourse and have been since Xi Jinping has risen to power. Which really, if you're a business person, and there's so many smart business people in China and lawyers who I work with, very smart, very pragmatic. I mean, I think communism breeds some of the most pragmatic people in the world, right? They don't sugarcoat things. They know exactly what the system means to them. They know exactly how to work within the system. And so you find tons of creativity, even though, the economic model stifles creativity to some degree within the system. You see endless creativity because everyone's trying to live two lives. They've all got two sets of books. It feels like a spy novel. Every time I talk to someone about what's really going on in China, I say, well, let me tell you. And it's always very eye-opening. So in terms of things that the Communist Party is not okay with, and I think you as business people and others who advise business people, if your clients are in any of these spaces, you are going to, I hope that the bells go off, because there are a lot of safe areas to do business in China. There are less safe areas. So areas where, the idea that money worship, this hedonism or love of pleasure, egocentricity, all those three things I think are anything that's ego driven, right? Anything money driven, all the things that they see as what's wrong with the West and why the West can't clean, why we have all these problems. They attribute it a lot to these things, right? Too much focus on money in a capitalistic society. Online discourse, of course, is still a problem in China. And then this idea, I find this quite hilarious, actually, that the Communist Party says we don't want to ignore the past, right? Because they're looking at China as a 2,000-year history, and Taiwan, all we're doing is reclaiming what's rightfully ours. It was part of the grand empire before. So I think it's funny that their definition of history is very fluid, depending on who they're talking to and depending on what their purposes are. China still has, even though you're probably reading that the economy is not doing as well as the Chinese hope it would, energy continues to be a big business. Social awareness continues to grow, kind of percolating under the surface. China had a Me Too moment for a minute last year, and then of course they're focusing on big data protection, data privacy, and then we have these kind of fun blips that are really features of the system rather than bugs in China, which are all of a sudden your ambassador or one of your top generals can just disappear for a few months and then resurface later and tell you what they've been doing wrong. Whether or not that's accurate, we don't know, and we may never know. Okay, next one. I use this as a pretty fun litmus test for the China-US influence campaign, because right now we have two major global superpowers. And so this is I don't have the full background. I don't have it up here on the slide. So the background is last fall, there was a referendum at the UN on should we hold a discussion on China's treatment of the Uyghurs in the Uyghur Autonomous Region in northwestern China, Xinjiang. And so this I see as a referendum on where countries have fallen on one side or the other, either with the US. So green, the ones that voted green said, yes, we should have this discussion. We should absolutely air this out. Red are China's allies. They said absolutely no. And then the ones that I circled, several that I circled here, are countries that have emerged to kind of stay the strategic neutrality. They want to be neutral. So, and these are important countries to us, okay? Countries like India, countries like Mexico, Malaysia, Brazil. These are all countries that understand, okay, we don't have, we need to play both sides. We need to be friendly with the US. We need to be friendly with China. There's no way around it. So this is what I see as an interesting referendum on where we are. I don't see this changing in the near term. So if you have business interests in Brazil, India, Mexico. I think that you should be okay. I think they'll be able to keep walking the line. It'll always be a little bit weird, but they're not. I don't see any of these countries flipping and saying we're 100% with the U.S. Even Mexico, I see that they're going to keep walking their line, and so it's not necessarily bad. It's just kind of what I'm seeing is happening in the global sphere. I think that's all I've got, Mike.
Awesome.
Over to you.
Well, I wanted to touch on expansion targets. So from a tax perspective, I work with a lot of companies that are expanding globally, and kind of the top countries that I see, which I put up there, are Canada. Canada's proximity to the United States, their similar attitudes toward capitalism, the economy drives in many of the same ways that the US does. We like to say, well, they have socialized medicine up there. Sure, but the reality is their appetites are similar to ours. Their way of conducting business is similar to ours. So if a company is looking to expand internationally, that's a great starting point. They have a common set of laws, back to legal matters. And so you can typically, with some assistance, navigate an expansion into Canada. The EU gets a little more complicated. I see a lot of companies expanding into the EU. Typically, they start with a country like Ireland, just because common language, similar kind of basis from a rule of law, similar economy, taste, drivers, etc. But the great thing about Ireland is through Ireland, you can get to the rest of the EU without having to establish entities in every EU country. The other one I see a fair bit is the Netherlands, as far as a launching point into mainland Europe. And then the UK is different. Many of you know that Brexit happened, so the UK was part of the EU. And from a, I guess, doing business perspective, the EU allows for reduced barriers to conduct business across the countries of the EU. That's the benefit of doing business in Ireland, for example. You can sell products across the EU with pretty low barriers. The UK is very popular just because, again, common history, common language, common approach to business, but they are not part of the EU anymore and do not give you kind of that lower barriers access into the EU. So I separated them out. If you want to get into Asia Pacific, Australia is often a really popular place to go. Again, they speak English, common, similar theme here, common history, common business practices. They're a lot like Canada, but they're in Asia Pacific, so they're a lot closer to places where a lot of manufacturing happens, like the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and China, of course. And then China, I added there at the end. A lot of companies in the US want to do business in China. I mean, they have billions of potential customers, but the barriers are very high and the challenges are very extensive. So you do not want to try to expand into China without really understanding what the consequences are. So I've seen, probably more than expanding into China, expanding into other Asia Pac countries that are less challenging, like a Taiwan or Korea, Philippines. Even Vietnam has become pretty open to U.S. business, even though they're have historically been tied to China.
Mike, do you feel like the Brits shot themselves in the foot with Brexit? Have you seen kind of a marked change in saying, okay, we would have set up in the UK before, now we're definitely going through Ireland? Is that a common theme?
It is, actually. I think from in many respects, I think they shot themselves in the foot, actually. But certainly from a business expansion perspective, you can go into Ireland and then sell into the UK, a lot easier than you can go into the UK and sell into Ireland. And so it creates a disadvantage from an international business perspective for the UK. I think there's also a lot of, I'll call it buyer's remorse. I think a lot of people from a very nationalistic perspective voted for Brexit. And now, a couple of years down the road, they're kind of seeing maybe this wasn't as great of a deal as we thought it was. They really saw themselves as kind of funding the European Union and propping up a bunch of other countries and didn't really want to do that. But as they've found, being isolated from the EU creates its own disadvantages from an ability to kind of operate in that European marketplace. And so I think it's been challenging for them. I think they still think, well, we have all these former former parts of the great British Empire that we can continue to lean on those relationships. And so that compensates a little bit as far as India and Australia and Canada and others.
It's interesting. I know that Netherlands has really positioned itself to take a lot of the banking that was in the UK before. Great. Okay, so let's go to here's my temperature. I'm gonna have to come over here so I can see this a little better. Then I can point. So and I promise you I'm better at formatting this. I should have PDF'd it, but I don't usually spell Australia, but it's all right. It works. So I picked 3 statistics, okay? 3 statistics to help me think about how, and I spend so much time with my clients trying to figure out where do we go? What do we do? What's the kind of global business plan? And a lot of them, because a lot of them are just trying to figure out for the first time what's most attractive to us and what do we need. So I end up asking them a lot of questions. Where are you trying to go? Where's your customer base? Can you get financing partners? Do you have already key people in the country? What do you need? And what's your reasoning for going there? All kinds of questions. And so I found this. So this TMF group, if you're kind of stats nerd and you want to get a feel for the global marketplace, I recommend checking out TMF Group. They've got tons of resources. They're basically a company that specializes in helping companies set up entities around the world. So they have this. So I picked these 3. So we have overall complexity of the country, and this is to do business. Okay, overall complexity to do business, employment rights, which I use as an important proxy because in the U.S., depending on where you live, we either love employees or we tolerate employees, right? And then in cost, this is in terms of what's the prosperity level of the country, right? So I'm just going to run through this quickly here. I won't go through everything in detail. And I have the U.S. over here as our comparison, right? So even though the reason that the U.S. is, and this was out of like 84, 88 countries or something like that, the reason the U.S. is only 3rd out of 10 and we would be 1 out of 10 if every state was uniform, right? The U.S. is basically least complex of any jurisdiction, which is, I don't know if the tax guys feel the same. I feel like U.S. is decently complicated, but also when I talk to European lawyers or Asian lawyers, and I'm like, what do you mean 3 months to set up an entity? Like, what are you talking about? I can do this in an afternoon. If you have somebody with a U.S. Social Security number, don't tell Mike this, I can get you an entity in a day. I can set you up. You have an entity running. You go get your bank account. So the U.S. is 10th overall. We're positioned quite well, or 10th overall, and this was on a 10 scale, right? So Canada, not too far behind. Ireland, not too far behind the U.S. Same with Australia, Singapore. So there are reasons why these jurisdictions come up a lot. Say, well, I want to set up in Asia. Singapore sounds like a good idea. You're looking at Singapore. That's a great idea, except when you get down here, Singapore ranks 10 out of 10 because everyone's prospered in Singapore, which means you're going to pay for it, right? So whereas we have something like Mexico, where we have 74 out of 78, and it's 9 out of 10 on employment rights, because I learned from a Mexican lawyer I talked to a few weeks ago when I was in Brazil, you have to save 10% of profits for Mexican employees. Like that's an across the board. It doesn't matter whether you like your employees or whatever, 10% goes to the employees. The nice thing is your employees aren't that rich, right? Your employees don't make that much money. So it's easier to save aside 10% of the profits for them rather than, than others. So I chose these countries on purpose. And I think that depending on the type of business model, right? Whether you're employee heavy, whether you're heavy in sales, right? If you're just a direct sales company, employment stuff doesn't matter that much because everyone has their own network. And of course, you're going to be paying people anywhere, but it's good to know what the relative prosperity level is based on the country you're looking at. Okay, Rand, next one. Okay, this is it's very colorful. This is mine, by the way. So because this is how I think about the world. When after we identified the kind of countries we want to go into, then I help people think about all right, the business model first, because we have there are lots of different ways to go into a country, right? I have clients in all different phases. China right now, the biggest issue with China is getting out of joint ventures. That's been happening, trending, and it's kind of accelerating now. Everyone took a breath. I say, during COVID and after, everyone's kind of breathing. We're trying to see, how deep is the recession going to go? But most of them have decided that China is risky, and not that they don't want to be in China. They don't want to be this deep in China with a partner. So I spend a lot of time looking at, unwinding joint ventures. If we are selling product into the country, then typically we're looking for a good licensee, someone who will be a good distributor partner, and then we just decide how deep to go in with them. Whether we just want to license the IP, we want to run it more like a franchise and call the shots a little more, or we just trust them and we say, here, we're just going to sell you product. You go and figure it out yourself. So a lot of different ways. We just hired a Chinese trained attorney. He's from China, and he's a direct selling expert. And he and I talk a lot about Chinese e-commerce as the alternative model for direct sales companies and for anyone who wants to sell. Because if you can crack the Chinese e-commerce model, it's the lowest risk way to really do business there. And e-commerce is very popular. Problem is, across the 1.4 billion cell phone holders in China, everyone has their niche areas. So there are some clear winners in terms of e-commerce. There are some that lag behind a bit. And then there are companies that just don't care. And I have a Japanese client that has been burned in China 2 or 3 times. Their direct sales company had people go to jail both times. The government tracked all the credit card numbers for all the purchasers. And then when they came in again, they rebranded, but they didn't make sure that all their 4,000 distributors had gotten new credit cards. And so they got whacked right away. And so it's been a fun but awful exercise to go through with them to figure out what the right way is to dial that into China. And so this is my world. Like, in a nutshell, this is really everything that I think about in terms of how we get in, how we structure relationships, and how we get out. We can come back to this later, but I want to make sure Mike has enough time too.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So, as I advise companies, and thank you, as they look to expand, the first place we usually start is, what are you selling? Because there are different aspects to global expansion when you're dealing with tangible products, digital products, et cetera, licenses, services. So tangible products, obviously there's logistics involved. So it's not just tax. And because there are logistics involved, there's, documentation of import records, and the government can find out pretty easily that there's stuff coming into their country and what's coming in and a little bit what it's worth. And so there's a high level of risk and compliance when it comes to tangible products. And so your approach to expanding globally, needs to recognize and account for that. That's why a lot of my clients that expand globally look at setting up an entity, because having a legal entity in that jurisdiction to facilitate the import of tangible products is really important and can be really helpful, but it also can be very expensive. So it's something to consider. Digital products is kind of this new thing that countries are really trying to grapple with, because if you're selling software as a service, or you're selling licenses, or if you're an app developer on your phone and you're trying to get that app in the hands of, customers, countries like Canada and the UK and the EU, they all want to know about these sales. They all want to tax these sales. They want their piece of the prosperity that you're generating from their client base. And so they establish rules like, for example, in Canada, if you sell more than $30,000 of product into Canada, whether it's tangible product or digital product or services even, you know, they want you to license and collect and remit GST and HST, for example. And so the type of product really informs kind of the risks and how to mitigate those risks from a global expansion perspective.
Mike, do most countries have a threshold? Do they have a minimum threshold before you have to, or is it just kind of a, I mean, how enforced is that? You know, how much I'm just curious, like kind of generally globally. I'm asking for a friend. Okay.
Absolutely. So if you want to go to the next slide really talks about consumer tax, because that's the first thing companies that expand globally run into. And I hate to admit this, but I'm going to. The US started this whole thing, and they started the whole thing with Wayfair and state consumer taxation because South Dakota wanted to be able to tax digital commerce fundamentally. And so they wanted to be able to enforce companies collecting and remitting sales tax on products that are sold digitally, products that are sold online, whether they're tangible goods or digital goods. And so they started this whole concept of economic nexus. And as soon as the US did it, like every country in the world was like, wait a second, you mean we can just set an arbitrary threshold and then we can enforce companies to register and collect and remit sales tax, or our version of sales tax, which US is sales tax, Canada, Australia, India, former UK jurisdictions are GST and HST. That stands for goods and services taxes, or hybrid services taxes, which is similar to VAT. VAT is value added tax. That's what's mostly in the rest of the world. And then there's a couple of countries that have a use tax where the buyer pays the tax directly to the government instead of to the seller. But the big thing in this area right now are these economic thresholds. So Canada established an economic threshold at $30,000, which if you're in business, and all of you are to some degree or other, you'd recognize that $30,000 of sales is nothing. Like you can eclipse that in 1 month. So into Canada, just, you know, as you initially begin to expand into Canada. And they're all different. Canada's 30,000, Mexico's completely different. Different EU jurisdictions have different thresholds. One thing that is helpful though is if you register for VAT in the UE, your European Union, you're kind of covered for the entire EU. So if you register in Ireland, then you administer VAT through your Irish registration, even if you're selling into the other jurisdictions into the EU. So that's helpful. But the UK, all of the countries that we've talked about in this conversation have now adopted thresholds for establishing a requirement to register, collect, and remit. So if you start to sell globally, and you need to be mindful that a lot of these are pretty low. Not all of them are as low as Canada, but I typically see 100,000, 200,000 in sales as thresholds for economic nexus when it comes to consumer taxes.
That's gross sales.
Gross sales, yeah.
How important are the tax treaties then in terms of making sure you're not paying twice and structuring your chain of commerce?
I think that's a great question, and I appreciate that.
That's a dumb lawyer question because I know it's important. I just don't know how important.
And that's the interesting thing. Because sales taxes are a consumer tax, including VAT and GST, they typically aren't covered by treaty because they're paid conceptually by the buyer. So if you have a customer in Canada, they're not protected by the US-Canadian tax treaty if they're purchasing product from a US company. And the US company isn't protected by the treaty to avoid collecting and remitting that tax on behalf of the consumer. But ultimately, it's the consumer that's funding these taxes. And so it makes it really difficult because we don't have kind of the treaty protection that we have in other areas of taxation when it comes to consumer tax. Because if you're selling $100,000 software to a company in Canada to manage their business in a meaningful way, your requirement is to collect the tax from that customer and then remit that tax to the Canadian authority on behalf of that customer. But it's really the customer's financial obligation. And it only becomes yours if you fail to do it.
So it impacts your bottom line. If you
Yeah.
don't, right, it comes out, you are the agent for the government
You are.
to collect the tax. And so if you don't collect it, it comes out of your one of your line items, right?
Yep.
Idiot tax. Nice.
You're up.
Thanks. Okay, so when I'm looking at countries, we've talked a lot about former we call them common law because they came from British common law. So anywhere the British flag used to sail, the Union Jack, those tend to be the ones where at least from the US where we tend to look. And these are an interesting mix of what I consider kind of normal regular places, like you take a Canada, Australia, UK, and then we have places that I consider we used to call tax havens. So you have your BVI, your Caymans, anything else. I mean, they're little islands. And as I've been getting more into crypto, I learn about all these little islands with 30,000 people, and they've got their own regime of law, and they're trying to become whatever. They're trying to become a haven for anything. I mean, any tax revenue for them goes a long way, I've got to imagine. So, or whether it's tax revenue, whether it's revenue just from being known as the Delaware of the Caribbean, and where everybody needs to set up an entity, and then they charge through the nose to set up entities, right? I can set up an entity for a few $100 in the US and minimum 5,000-10,000 in those jurisdictions. It's just unreal. And it takes 3 months too. And then they have these public register of shares. And, in the US, all my clients that are coming to the US, they're like, so what are we going to have to report to the government? I'm like, well, let's see. Delaware just wants to know the name of your company, the name of your registered agent, and they want your $300. And they're like, are you serious? That's it? Like they can't get over how little the government has in terms of our, kind of nose in, although that is changing as of January 1.
KYC.
Yes, it's becoming a real thing in the US. So there really won't be anywhere to hide, but it still won't be public, right? The government's going to know who all the beneficial owners are for every entity that's registered in the US starting January 1, 2024. I can't remember exactly what that database is going to be called, but you'll be hearing more about it these next few months if you haven't already heard about it.
It's tied in with FinCEN, I think.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting who's Treasury is probably going to be administering that. So that'll be on us, right? That's going to be we're going to help with the reporting obligations for all of your partners that want to set up subsidiaries in the US. It's just going to be a fact of life. It's not going to be that awful. It's not going to be like European awful. Then we have the common law countries, which feel very familiar, kind of the contract law, rule of law. Feels very familiar and at home. And then civil law, that's where things get weird for us because we're just not used to it, right? The code is very formulaic. They tend to be more prescriptive in terms of this is absolutely what you have to do. In the US, we have the laissez-faire, just do your business, do no harm, make your money, then do good with the profits that you have. And the European model is certainly different. So most of Europe, most of Asia, China, a lot of Latin America and some of Africa. So it's a big part of the world. If you're doing business, whether your first time or your 50th time, every country is a little bit different, and you just have to get used to the way that things feel as you're moving through. Back over to you, Mike, for some PE talk.
Okay, great.
That's not private equity. In my world, it's private equity. In your world, it's permanent establishment.
Permanent establishment. So as you begin to grow your business internationally, the next thing you kind of run into after consumer tax is what's called permanent establishment. And permanent establishment is kind of the global equivalent of Nexus. And Nexus is, do you have too close a tie to pretend like you shouldn't have to pay tax in that jurisdiction? And that's where treaties predominantly come into play. So when you're initially just selling product into the country, for example, if you're just shipping product to Canada from the US, you may have to collect and remit sales GST, goods and services tax, but you can avoid income tax in Canada predominantly. And there's a great US Canadian tax treaty that ensures that's the case, right? You can do business in Canada and not file and remit income tax on your profits. You can keep all the profits in the US. It's great. But as you begin to grow and you need a bigger presence in Canada, then we have to look at things like agency relationships and whether those relationships create a presence in Canada that would expose us to taxation, even given the treaty. And certainly from an importing tangible goods perspective, you might need a company in a foreign jurisdiction in order to assist in the import-export process. And so that will create a presence in the country. So
can I say something about that?
Yeah.
There's an analogous, I don't know if it's analogous, but similar concept. Like China is very locked down in terms of what companies can do. You know, if you're a representative office or you're a let's see, rep office, then you can be a wholly foreign owned enterprise. And so based on your registration, based on the kind of the legal status of the entity, you know, you get into a lot of trouble in China if you just start putting people to work, right, without having an entity there. Yeah. Or if you set up the wrong type of entity, like if I'm dealt with so much cleanup last year with some private equity folks who were buying companies that had been around, you know, they kind of set up in the early days of China, early 2000s, mid 2000s, set up as you know, as initial kind of test the market companies where they had very limited scope on what they could do, and then everybody just kind of ignores what's going on, and suddenly it's a full-blown operation that they should have changed, and it's not easy to flip from a representative office to a full-blown entity there. And then you get then they're trying to turn around and sell it to my clients, and I'm like, well, you know, look at this trail of mess that you left behind, and everybody's bowing out. And this, since it's private equity run, the current managers say, well, I wasn't even involved at the early days. You know, no one wants to take any responsibility. And so they just try to keep passing it down and down and down the line. And so that's going to be a very common theme I think we'll be dealing with in my world for probably at least 10 years, is just cleaning up junk in China that everyone ignored. I think we'll probably see the same thing in India, in Mexico, Brazil. It's just the way it is when the government bureaucrats are so focused on getting business in the door, compliance goes out the window, and everyone's fine. They said, well, we've never had an issue with this before. I can tell you how many thousands of times I've heard it, right? This has never burned us before. So it hasn't been a problem. Why are you making a big deal of it, lawyer? You're just trying to hold up the closing on this transaction. And I'm thinking, well, that's because you're trying to transfer all of the risk to 10 years of idiocy in China to my clients, right? And I'm not okay with that.
Yeah. So if you're acquiring entities in China to facilitate your global expansion, make sure you're really careful.
You need to tie that off. That's a whole bucket of risk over here. Just stick it way over to the side.
Because you touched on the real elements of risk. Fundamentally, from a tax perspective as well as a legal perspective, it's having employees doing work in that jurisdiction. So if you're going to set up an entity to facilitate importing product, and then you find you have a need for employees there, that expands your risk of local jurisdictional tax and legal challenges specifically. The other one that is a main driver is acquiring property. So it's a physical location. So if you have a physical location, if you have employees, there's no treaty that's going to get you out of a taxable presence in a foreign jurisdiction.
What about co-working? Can I just have a co-working space, Mike? Does that count? It's not, you know, like, because this is the question, right? So we're talking about leasing. Leasing would count as having a presence too. You don't have to own the real estate.
Yep.
Okay. Co-working?
Co-working, I believe,
from home?
Creates risk. So if you have employees that are working remotely in Spain, for example, you have a permanent establishment risk. You have an employee physically located in Spain doing work for your company, and Spain, under the U.S.-Spanish tax treaty, could claim that you have a taxable presence in their country and you should be filing tax returns and paying tax in their country. And if we could go to the next slide.
That includes our kids who want to be digital nomads and work all over the world. They're going to be creating problems every time they go from Bermuda to Berlin to wherever. It's sit around for 3 months and 3 months.
Exactly.
Tell them to keep moving. That's the goal, right? You can't stop. You can't stop anywhere. You get maximum 2 months, and then you have to move.
And what people tell me is, oh, it's okay. They're just an independent contractor. The problem is independent contractors create the same legal and employment permanent establishment risk that an employee creates. So you can't even solve the problem that way, sadly.
On the law side, we can get a little more fuzzy, but I get it from the tax side. There's very clear lines.
So when you have an employee in a foreign jurisdiction, you could create a de facto branch. So what that means is, yes. Yeah.
A PEO.
Yeah, so PEOs create some of the same risks because it's all about how much control you have over that employee from a tax jurisdictional perspective. So if you control when they work and how they work, and you, through your PEO, provide them with all of the equipment they need to work, and it also depends on what they're doing for you. So some treaties have a carve out that says if all the employee's doing is shipping product out of your warehouse, then you're fine. So it's a little bit what they're doing and how much control you have over them. But a lot of companies try to avoid PE risk through PEOs, and there's a differentiation. You can avoid payroll risk through PEOs. And that's really what they're designed to do.
And legal for like social components of the paycheck, right? Because you've got social insurance, you've got all those benefits. So that's usually why people who I talk to go through PEOs, because they want to avoid any questions there. But this is really interesting.
Right. But what you have to be careful of is what is that employee doing for you, because you can create an agency relationship that will create a permanent establishment. So if that employee has the ability to sign contracts and bind the U.S. company, it doesn't matter if they're an agent, it doesn't matter if they're a PEO or they're a full-blown employee, they will create PE risk for your company. So unfortunately, it's nuanced. It has to do with what's their relationship with the company, how much control do you have over them, and what, power do they have relative to the company to bind the company and obligate the company legally.
Okay, so here's my legal brain on this. Yes. It would be, the nice thing is we have digital signatures. So it would be, I hate having two people sign a contract for a company, but that's a really good reason why it would be good. If they can't unilaterally bind the company and you need a signature from somebody at home, I just solved the world's problems, Mike. It's done. We're done. Let's go home.
Thank you for solving that. The other thing that most treaties carve out is salespeople. So you can have a salesperson that's in a PEO that's not an employee,
even if they're
of the
exclusive
company.
to you.
Yeah, even if they're exclusive to you. But it has to be a treaty country. So don't send them to Singapore because we don't have a treaty with Singapore.
Singapore's totally neutral. They don't. They love everyone and hate everyone equally.
Fair. Okay. If you find yourself, we'll skip foreign joint venture, but those are a pain, and we already talked about that with China. But if you find yourself in a situation where you have a de facto presence in a foreign jurisdiction, you may want to seriously consider setting up a foreign partnership or a foreign subsidiary in order to mitigate your risk. Because ultimately, if you set up a separate legal entity, then that becomes the Canadian tax, in my example of Canada, becomes ameliorated around that entity. And so you can protect your U.S. company and your U.S. profits from the Canadian operations by having a separate legal entity in Canada, whether it's a disregarded entity, foreign partnership, or subsidiary from U.S. tax purposes.
Are other countries' partnership laws, taxation for partnership, are they as messy as the U.S., or is the U.S. like, because I'm amazed every time we talk about a client that's coming to the States. And I'm like, well, yeah, you could do, you could be a single member LLC, or you could do a corporation. And I'm like, but you should talk to Mike. And Mike's like, okay, don't listen to Jonathan. You want to do a C Corp, period. You don't want a US, you don't want to, is it, and that's partnership context, right? So are other countries as bad as the US? Is that your advice? Other places too, or are they more manageable from a tax perspective?
I think they're manageable from a tax perspective, but you really have to look at kind of the individual facts and circumstances, because sometimes the risk is low and having like income flow as well as foreign taxes, or particularly losses. If you set up operations in a foreign jurisdiction, sometimes it's helpful for U.S. purposes to have those losses pull through to the U.S. to mitigate your U.S. liability, for example. But the crazy thing is you can have different treatment in different jurisdictions. So, and this kind of speaks to your point.
Canada.
Yeah, you may want a Canadian entity that pays its own tax in Canada and isn't part of your US filing for Canadian purposes, but then you have losses that pull through for US purposes. And so sometimes we do some complicated structuring in order to kind of get a desired result, where you can have the same entity be taxed different ways by different jurisdictions.
Your world is tons of fun, Mike. I'm getting
We
excited.
love it.
This is great. Yeah.
Well, I want to save time for questions. So
Yeah,
you
yeah,
wanna
of course.
wrap up?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, I've got just a couple, and these I can go over these fairly quickly. So when I'm crafting a contract or even talking strategy with clients, I always begin with the end in mind, which is that this relationship is going to break up, right? It's not good, but you start with the prenup, because there are very few businesses that continue blissfully into the sunset, right? It's just not a fact of life. People change, their priorities change, their life situation changes. This is true whether you're dealing with employees, upline partners, downline partners, joint venture partners. I've never written, sadly, I've never written a perfect contract yet that dealt with all of the twists and turns that came along later, right? We keep trying to find the optimal thing, but people are people, and laws change and motivation changes. So when I'm looking at international dispute resolution, because that's really what we're talking about, I try to craft our contracts so that first of all, I try to find out if my clients are going to be the one to breach or the other side is going to breach, because this happens a lot. I have clients that are doing business with China, and I say, okay, what's the most likely scenario for breaching? And they're like, well, we could go bankrupt if somebody enters the market. So we're more likely to breach than the other side, because the other side is just producing battery packs. Like they sell a gazillion of these, and we buy them. We're not even their main customer. More likely that we'll breach than they'll breach. And nobody likes to think about that, but it is a good exercise to think about, like, what's really going to go wrong in the relationship. And so sometimes I will, with my China stuff, I will purposely choose enforcement in China, because that means that my client would have to go to China, and they have no intention of going to China, right? They don't. They're going to do all the business from overseas. And if we're going to breach, I'm going to make it as hard as possible for the Chinese side to be able to get to my client. Now, that may be an underhanded thing from a lawyer's perspective, and that's why I get a bad rap. Maybe, right? But that's my job, is to make sure that even if my client is the one that has something unfortunate happen, that it's not easy for the other side to get into the bank accounts or the assets. And of course, flip it on its head. If the other side in Mexico or China or Israel is going to be the one to breach, then I'm going to make sure that I tailor it so that we can enforce it. We can get it dealt with quickly, and we can enforce it wherever the other side has assets, whether that's real estate, anything else. So that's all on dispute resolution. Last one, I think, Rayanne. This is really more of my summary, high level summary. A lot of you think that the first thing you want to do is send the NDA over, but really the first thing you want to do is register your IP, okay, before you do anything else. I don't care which jurisdiction you're in. If you have a product, if you're sending people to to Guangzhou, you're going to Singapore for a trade show, the first thing you want to do is make sure your IP is registered in the States, which you can expand artificially to other treaty countries. But that's really the place to start, because that gives you sharp elbows to throw around if someone starts competing with you in, maybe they take your card, they go back to China, they go to the Philippines, and suddenly your competitor has been created, and they're using, they registered their mark, your mark in their country, and now they're exporting to your home market, and you didn't register. Maybe you always meant to register in the US and never got around to it. Yep. And that happens a lot in the foreign countries, in foreign markets. I'm amazed at the companies I talk to. I say, so you've been selling into the Middle East for 6 months, and now and you don't have your mark, like it just fell by the wayside, the whole discussion about the IP. So that's the spiel. Let's do some Q&A.
Let's do some questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rayanne.
Yeah. Sorry.
I actually have 2 questions just to follow up on the registration of the IP. Is that you're saying within the countries in which we want to do business, or here in the States? In that country.
If you're here, absolutely register. I'll do Mike, because I think we might still be recording. So yeah, absolutely at home, no matter what. U.S. registration, trademarks, especially, very cheap. Copyrights, you can do that. You already have a whenever you produce written content or audible, whatever's copyrightable, you already have the copyright in that, but registering it with the Copyright Office lets you get attorney's fees if you have to fight about it, if someone's infringing on that. So that's copyright. Trademark, yeah, I mean, it's low hanging fruit. You know, you can have your college intern just figure it out, fill it out. It may not be great, but at least to get your toe in the door. You know, I'm all for hiring attorneys to do it the right way, but if you're on a budget, you might as well file your word mark and see if it sticks for $300, right? Super easy. It takes a little bit of time, but at least you can get your toe in the door. But yeah, I mean, and then whichever countries you're thinking about going to, that common law versus civil law really matters, because common law jurisdictions, when you start using that mark in commerce in that country, you have some common law rights, and you have the rights, but then you need to go and file. Whereas other civil law countries, a lot of them, whoever files first wins. And so if you are doing business and you don't have, so even if you've been doing business there for years, but somebody else had filed their mark and they're just sitting on the mark, then they can push you out, or they can make you negotiate really hard and pay $100,000 for your own trademark, even though they did no business with it. So it's I mean, the IP offices around the world, even in China, are getting smarter to this, and they're not dealing with they're dealing better with trademark squatters. But it's such a low hanging fruit for the cost, that you absolutely should just say, okay, we're gonna Madrid Protocol, we're gonna just send it all over the world. We'll pay the money, and then you at least know, okay, this is our flagship brand. We have to at least protect this one, and then you build from there.
And then, thank you. Follow-up question. I don't want to sound like I'm the smartest guy in the world about China, but recently the World Trade Center in Utah hosted an event with former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, who advised U.S.-based companies to get out of China entirely by 2027.
The military wants you to run from China? That's shocking.
Well, he's just saying from a stability standpoint, assume that it's all gonna.
No, and I get that, right?
2027.
I get that side of the equation too. I'm tongue in cheek. I'm very pragmatic, okay, and I'm very invested in China. I spent 20 years studying Chinese. And so for me, and my kids are in immersion school still, I didn't pull them out when I saw what was happening. It's risk. Yeah, there's absolutely risk in China. And so, but it's like any house of cards, any gambling house you walk into, you play and you watch the stakes and you keep track of all the indicators, and you pull out as soon as you feel uncomfortable. Like that's how I advise you go into China. And you make sure that your contracts are papered the right way. So when you got to turn tail and run, because the government's now seizing all real estate in Gansu province, and that's where your factory is, then you can get out. And yeah, you're going to have some losses, but I don't think you pull out now. I mean, I'm not in the DOD. I'm not in the State Department. I don't have strategic purposes for advising you to do certain things. My goal is to just help people figure out you make money while you can, and then you diversify, and it's a risk diversification game. Yeah.
Thank you for the information provided. Is there a way to get a copy of this presentation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, who has the last question?
Who's got the better bow tie? That's the question. Mike does. I like Mike's better than Mike's.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for coming to this lunch. Really appreciate having you here. Is it better to talk to this one? Okay. We really appreciate having you here. Please feel free to contact Mike and Jonathan. I think, do they have your contact information? If not, we'll send it out with the slides after this, so that you can ask any questions you need to about how to scale your business safely internationally. So thank you again. Please take your plates or anything, if you do us a big favor, and throw them in the trash on the way out. It helps us clean up a little quicker. Have a good day.